Good afternoon. Thank you for bearing with us in our technical difficulties. Every April, the Office for Victims of Crime, OVC, leads communities through the country in their annual observances of National Crime Victim Rights Week. This year, the Victim Services Division of the Sonoma County DA's office has granted funding by the OVC to commemorate April 21st through 27th as National Crime Victims Rights Week. Our events serve to honor crime victims and survivors, recognize the professionals and volunteers who provide critical services to victims of crime, and raise awareness about crime victims' rights and services. During this webinar, we will hear about a survivor story that will provide a deeper understanding of victims' experiences. Our panel will discuss challenges victims face and the best way to collaborate within each level of care that's needed. The goal is to provide a platform for us to learn from and educate one another so that solutions can be found to improve the overall health and outcomes for victims of crime. Trauma-informed care acknowledges the need to understand the person's life experiences, past and present, in order to deliver effective care. We are very pleased to be hosting this webinar, and thank you for being here with us today. Before I have each panelist introduce themselves, I would like to share that this panel will be recorded, and opinions or points of view expressed in this webinar and recording represent those of the speakers and do not necessarily represent the official position or policies of the Sonoma County District Attorney's Office. Any commercial products and manufacturers discussed in these recordings are presented for informational purposes only and do not constitute product approval or endorsement by the Sonoma County District Attorney's Office. So without further ado, I would like each panelist to introduce themselves and share a little bit about their professional background before we take a look at Elizabeth's story. Okay, so Alex, why don't you start?
My name is Alex Perry, and I'm a victim advocate with the Sonoma County District Attorney's Office. I assist survivors of crime, all types of crime, anything from property assaults, sexual related crimes, domestic violence, and other serious crimes.
Awesome.
Oh, I'm
Rena?
next. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, well, looking at the camera. Hey, and Maya Iwa, she's Chima Emtha, Reno County Franklin, Chairman Emeritus, Kashaya Pomo Tribe. Board member of Sonoma County Indian Health, also a board member of California Rural Indian Health Board. So as an elected tribal official for 21 years, I have a unique perspective on not just how our victims are taken care of, but the tribal perspective and how that's done in a PL 280 state, which can make things extremely complicated in trying to advocate for victims' rights. So happy to join and speak on it.
Thank you. Cece?
My name is Cecile Fauché, and I recently retired after 25 years in law enforcement. I had been a detective in the Sonoma County Sheriff's Office Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault Unit, and later became the sergeant of that unit. I was with former DA Jill Ravitch as we put together the Family Justice Center. And in retirement now, or I was a chief investigator here in the Sonoma County District Attorney's Office. And I teach through the Santa Rosa JC Police Training Center up in Windsor. And I teach sex crimes and sex crimes investigations, hate crimes, racial profiling, cultural diversity, and sexual harassment and discrimination.
Thank you. Andy?
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for being here. My name is Andy Lucas. I'm a Chief Deputy District Attorney here at the Sonoma County DA's office. I've been attorney at the DA's office for 15 years, and I currently work with the attorneys who handle elder abuse cases, domestic violence cases, and sexual assault cases.
Thank you. Okay.
Hi, I'm Mary Champion. My pronouns are she, her, ella. I'm a school psychologist and licensed therapist at Sonoma County Office of Education in the Behavioral Health and Wellbeing Department. In my role there, I work with various schools and districts across Sonoma County to support the mental health and well-being of students. Part of my role is also to serve on our SOS team, which is Systems of Support, and we help support districts respond to crisis events.
and Betsy.
Yeah, hello. My name is Letsa Perez, and I am an advocate with Verity, Sonoma County's only sexual assault center. And I have been in this agency for 7 years in many different positions. So that's the expertise I bring. So thank you all for joining, and nice to meet you all.
Thank you. I am going to share my screen. So, oh, wait. Apologies. The rest of these people in. I'm going to read a narrative, the story of Elizabeth. We call her Liz. This isn't the full story. It's been shortened for the purpose of this webinar, but you can listen to it. It's a podcast put on by the OVC, and I really recommend listening to it if you haven't already. It's a very powerful story. So I will have this up here as I'm reading it. I realize it's a lot, but I'll read it out loud and then we can discuss. So Liz is the survivor of ongoing sexual violence at the hands of her spiritual advisor. When Liz sought assistance and support for both law enforcement and her local sexual assault victim services organization, she unfortunately experienced significant violations of her personal privacy and confidentiality. In 2013, Liz joined a spiritual group seeking guidance and direction to help navigate life's challenges she was facing. Her spiritual leader was significantly older than her and married with 4 adult daughters. He was a retired elementary school teacher and worked regularly with vulnerable people, which made Liz feel safe and comfortable to be around him. After her assaults, Liz ended contact with him. He began showing up at events she was working and stopped by her workplace to drop off letters in her work mailbox. Liz left her job after he rented office space in the place where she was working. He always presented himself as a calm, collected, loving person, and she appeared to be crazy because she would have panic attacks whenever he showed up. When Liz began to speak up and tell her story, he served her with a cease and desist letter and threatened her social work license if she were to reveal his identity. Liz was unemployed and uninsured and sought services at a local advocate agency. She was looking for counseling, support services, any other resources that were available to her. When she met with an advocate, Liz expressed her concern of not filing a police report right away and fears of not being believed. She shared how her abuser was trying to convince people that she had a mental health problem, which she did not, to make her appear crazy. The advocate promised her confidentiality and explained that victim advocates have a higher confidentiality standard than counselors because victim advocates cannot be subpoenaed in court. The advocate did not mention victim compensation services or connect Liz to any mental health support. In early 2017, Liz filed a police report after her abuser kept showing up at events and wouldn't leave her alone. Liz allowed her advocate to be present during her interview. For 50 minutes, the detective asked a lot of victim blaming questions like why she didn't fight back, why she didn't report this right away, why did she allow it to happen more than once. The victim had a hard time recalling the abuse in chronological order, and the detective was very impatient with her. The detective told Liz several times that there was no way that she was assaulted, and then told her that she needed to leave because there was another person waiting, but asked the advocate to stay behind. A few months later, Liz learned that a complaint had been filed against her with the Social Work Licensing Board. Based on information received in the complaint, a state investigator, a police officer, and a locksmith broke into her home for a welfare check. Liz was home during the break-in and was so scared she locked herself in the bathroom and called 911. She was also ordered by the licensing board to undergo mental evaluation to prove that she was not a danger to herself or others. Throughout this investigation, Liz received several aggressive calls from the state investigator and grew afraid of him. She eventually hired an attorney to help with all communication related to this complaint. After 8 months, the board determined that the allegations were not true and the case was closed. Liz later found out that her victim advocate took confidential information that she'd received from her and used it to file a complaint against her. That is a small part of Liz's story. Again, there's so much more details that we weren't able to tell you, so definitely listen to it. But we do have a couple questions that we'd like our panelists to go over so we can all learn from each other. What would your agency's initial approach to a story like Liz's be? And you're welcome to just jump in and let us know. Start.
Well, I will speak from the perspective of a advocate within a district attorney's office. You know, we may not be there at the initial reporting, but typically through a DA's office, once that report is received by our office, then an advocate will begin assisting the survivor. So I think up front, there would be a lot of supportive listening. I would be trying to meet the survivor where she is at and help her identify her needs, her concerns. There would be also assistance with resource referrals. Understanding in our scenario that she had a very negative interaction with one of the resources. We can also assist with some upfront safety planning. And there would also be a lot of education around the criminal justice process. That's kind of one of the bigger things when somebody initially comes in because they're not familiar with the system. So as an advocate in the DA's office, that's one of our upfront focuses.
And just to jump in on that, us as a community-based advocate, we like to approach every client with our 6 steps of crisis intervention, which is we ensure the client's safety, we define the problem, we provide support, and we examine alternatives or resources. We make a plan and we make a commitment. Our advocates let the survivors take fully control of their healing journey and through this whole process. When a person has gone through something traumatic, such as a sexual assault, they lose their power, they lose control over their lives. And so the first step to healing journey is to be heard and believed. And that's exactly what our advocates do. Not only that, our advocates also continue to make follow up with the client, just so we go hand by hand with them through this whole process.
Can I see some follow-up questions?
Sure.
So I think we see a lot of breakdowns in Liz's situation, and it happened between her and the advocacy center. And from hearing the story, it seems more like this was a community-based advocacy center as opposed to advocates associated with the DA's office, but I'm making some inferences there. Can you tell us where you saw some of the biggest breakdowns between that advocate and Liz?
Definitely. First of all, confidentiality, right? That advocate broke confidentiality. That advocate broke the promise of that advocate promised Liz, right? Of the confidentiality. So right there and then, red flag. And not to, throw that advocate under the bus. We're all humans, but we can learn from this, right? And then the next one would be just the fact that they didn't give resources. Like Alex said, give education around what resources are available to them. Most of the time, the survivors that have gone through something like this is probably their first time. They don't know the resources out there. And if you're not in a survivor's shoes or family member, friends that you have, that they have experienced sexual assault, you don't know these kinds of resources. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but the resources is very important. And also letting the survivor take control of how they want to do it, not, talking over them or, this is how we're going to handle it. And you have no say in this, no. Let the survivor take control, let them decide, and basically just listen and believe them and don't overstep what the client does not want the advocate to do. The survivor is at a very vulnerable place at that moment, and just the fact that the person that they confine this information to broke that trust is a huge step back, especially for those that are hearing the story, those victims out there that are hearing the story and realize oh, I'm not going to come forward because if they did this to this survivor, they're probably going to do it to me. So, yeah.
Interesting. Thanks.
The Indian country is small, You look at my reservation, we're at Stewart's Point. You've got 22, 23 houses up there. We've had similar incidents both there and then Indian country as a whole. It's more confusing here in Sonoma County, we meet with our sheriff's office, the tribal council does, so we have a good relationship. But I've had these kind of calls come into me directly as a tribal leader, tribal chair, and you struggle with it. And the first thing for us, and if this call had come into me, would have immediately just wanted to make sure that they were not in the same room or in the position to where that individual could do harm to them physically at that moment, because I've also gotten that call before as well. And, we do a lot of training with our staff for when people call and report this kind of thing. If it comes right to me or if it comes to somebody in the office, typically, Indian people are going to be more comfortable reaching out within their own tribal government and talking to them about that. Also being on our health board at Sonoma County Indian Health, I might also get a call there too. And so at that point, it becomes a safety issue, immediate safety issue. Then quickly, to a call to our local sheriff, whichever one it is at the time. We have their cell phone numbers. We'll call them and say, hey man, I just got this report. Can you do a welfare check on this individual? And then let's talk about next steps. And then it really is. I think in the past, like 10 years ago, if this had happened, we would have kind of let some staff know to make sure to keep an eye out. And now it's more, we've learned the hard way about the victims, the survivors' confidentiality, and it's tough to do that on a small reservation. We tell people all the time that that the concept of rape is foreign to Kashaya people. We have instances where the Russians had done that when they came down to Fort Ross and met with our people at our village of Matini. One story where a woman was raped and was so foreign, it was so horrible to her to have her person violated like that. She killed herself. And we don't have that kind of suicide thing historically. It was a really sad, traumatic incident. And before our people could seek retribution on those two Russian soldiers, the Russian commandant tried them and hung them both for the crime of rape on that Indian woman, which is the only case I know of that in the history of California, pre-contact stuff. But so we don't have like that, that background on how to deal with it. And it hasn't been until it got worse historically when we had the first BIA school in the state of California. It was right there on our reservation. Catholic priests, unfortunately, introduced the concept of child molestation to us there. And so that historic trauma goes on and on and on. And the reason I bring it up is because it leads to a real mistrust to authority other than in our own, which is why that call would come to me as a tribal chair first, or me as a health representative first. And I don't have those skills, it wasn't something that we taught until we decided to make all of our tribal council, all of our employees mandated reporters, so that we had some understanding of what do we do next? How do we open up these lines and protect these individuals? So we have that in place now. When those calls come in, we have a process. I think it's effective. I think that where we fall short is we don't know how to report back to the rest of the community who knows that this happened because the confidentiality rules. But all of a sudden they see that guy is still there. Well, why is this guy walking around? You guys aren't doing anything. And that's like the choke point for us. How do we do that and maintain some confidentiality and at the same time protect that victim? It's hard to keep confidentiality about the victim that's reporting. Really hard in that small community like that.
Absolutely. And I think collaboration from the law enforcement side, especially with the tribal council, because like you said, you'd get the call first and then reach out to the resident deputy or whoever would come to respond to it. And I think with law enforcement, we'll often have the initial contact, even if it's a delayed report, whether it's years gone by or recently happened. And that, can kind of sort of dictate how the investigation goes, how the interviews go, that sort of thing. And I can speak from teaching at the police academy that that's first and foremost, we talk about confidentiality, show them the confidentiality form. Marcy's Law, all those things are in place throughout. So officers and deputies are getting it from the time that they started the police academy. And we have a little advantage is once the report is written and the victim's name is not in the report anywhere, and that's become, pretty much commonplace now that the victim's name was not used anywhere in the narrative of the report. So redaction isn't necessarily a big concern to the DA's office because they're not going to have to scour through a 20-page report, taking out a name here and there. But having resources to know and having conversation and collaboration with, tribal leadership and advocates through Verity or Indian Health, having that kind of connection and not seeing the person face to face, seeing that victim first face to face, and having that trust, I think, is part of how we can repair relationships that can kind of traditionally been a little bit unaware, or deputies taking a report and not really explaining what the next step is or explaining why they have to ask these intrusive questions, and that kind of venue to let a victim know that being a survivor is also on the horizon too, and that they're not overpromising what we're doing with a case, depending on any, whether it's recently occurred or a very delayed report, not overpromising and not speaking like, okay, well, and one of the DA's office is going to contact you in this manner. It's sort of like understand what your role is, understand the other roles, and how we can kind of blend together in support of the victim, because ultimately that is what we're all about. Not about necessarily about finding the bad guy and putting him in jail. It's much more about supporting the victim and holding people accountable in whatever the law that was broken and whatever violation occurred for that victim, and really being supportive so that we don't have collateral damage in like the interview process or the reporting process, that it's as seamless as it can be to support the victims.
Yeah. I think, I know some of you touched on it, but we wanted to kind of talk about the professional guidelines that each of you have in your role with confidentiality, because I know we have two advocates here, but what you're held to is very different, and maybe you or Andy can touch on Brady and how that affects what a victim tells you and that sort of thing.
Sure. Well, I can start with the general rule, and then maybe we can hear from the two different advocacy organizations, the community-based organization and the advocacy organization with the DA's office, because there are such different rules. But when we're dealing with the law, there's a hierarchy of different legal provisions, and in the evidence code and the penal code, there might be privileges that protect confidentiality and things like that. In the penal code, there might be things that protect confidentiality and things of that nature. But one rule that trumps all of those rules is anything that is deemed to be constitutional. And one of the constitutional rules that we have to account for in every criminal case that we would file is what we generally call the Brady Rule. And that's a rule stemming from a case from 1966, I believe, in the Supreme Court. But essentially a rule that anybody who's on the prosecution team, and I'll define that term in a moment, but anybody who's on the prosecution team that has any information that is favorable to the defense, the district attorney, the prosecutor, has an obligation to disclose that during the course of the proceedings. So when we talk about who's on the prosecution team, the prosecution team would include the advocates at the DA's office, but would not, in most cases, include an advocate from a community-based organization. So confidentiality is going to differ because something that somebody at Verity might learn won't necessarily be conveyed to the prosecution, and the prosecution wouldn't be imputed with that knowledge. But something that a victim tells Alex is imputed on the prosecutor in the case. And if it's evidence that's favorable to the defense, I would have an obligation to turn it over. And I'll just give a real straightforward example. Let's say Alex is talking to a victim on the phone, and the victim says, I really just don't remember much from that night. I was so intoxicated. That's evidence that tends to bear on the witness's ability to recall the events from the night where whatever happened. That's something that we would then have an obligation to turn over because it would be favorable to the defense, could be material to the issues of guilt. So that's an example of what the Brady Rule is, and kind of where there's a constitutional provision that would take precedence in terms of our obligations over any maybe assumed confidentiality. So that's why, and I'll let you both talk a little bit more about this, but it's important to be clear with the people you're talking to. Cece used the word overpromise at one point, and I mean, I think we all know how important it is not to overpromise to anybody, because whereas we might say something casually to somebody who we encounter who's experienced something traumatic, they are really focused on the words that we say. So we might say something casually in passing, not thinking anything of it. And it's something that somebody really harps on and really focuses on and really tends to therefore create some expectations. We need to be so careful about that. But that's kind of going on a tangent. But in terms of confidentiality, I mean, generally in the criminal process, so, victims might not know that if they come forward, we can, if it's a victim to sexual abuse, they're never going to be outed in court in terms of who they are if they don't want. There's specific penal code provisions that allow us to protect their identity. So whereas we're telling the defense information about what happened, what the allegations are, the police report will not be a secret from the defense attorney. From the public, from anything that's said in open court, the victim's identity would be kept secret. So would all of their other personal identifying information, both in court as well as anything that's filed in a public document. So for example, a criminal protective order, that's going to have all the victim's actual information on it, but that will be a confidential document with the court. So we do a lot in court to protect identity. And one last thing in that regard, oftentimes we use a Jane Doe designation. We're not limited to using a Jane or John Doe designation. We can use any term that would provide anonymity. Some people get really weirded out by a Jane or John Doe designation because they associate with TV and an unknown dead body. So it can be really weird to some people. And the first time I heard that from someone, it seemed really obvious. But until I heard somebody say, I don't want to be Jane Doe, that sounds like I was killed. And it clicked. And it's like, yeah. So instead of saying you'll be a Jane Doe in this case, I like to take the approach, how would you like to be referred to? We can use any name you want. Some people as a default will use Jane Doe, but how would you like to be referred to? We could use your first name, we could use initials, we could use any name you'd like. So we can protect people's identity that way as well.
Yeah, I mean, I would just like to kind of add in from my perspective as an advocate in the DA's office, when I first meet with the survivor or any victim of crime, I very detailed and very clearly explain my role and what I can and cannot do. So one of the things specifically is I talked to the survivor about, I cannot discuss the facts of the case with you, and for the reasons Andy expressed. I also like to, when we're talking about the personal information of a victim, I will help educate the victim around Marcy's Law and those protections of their personal information. That's definitely a big worry of survivors when a case is first coming into the court system. And just another professional guideline I have when I'm dealing with like sensitive information of a victim and discussing that, when it's not facts of the case, I like to provide a lot of reflective listening. I like to acknowledge a survivor when they're being vulnerable, let them know that they're being heard and respected. That's really important, especially, at any time through the case, but especially upfront at that initial contact.
That's awesome. Thank you, Alex and Andy, for what you said. You validate the survivors and you listen to them, which is huge. That's definitely trauma informed. And so our confidentiality as a community-based advocate is, we have higher confidentiality. So what we tend to tell our survivors is that whatever they tell us stays within us unless they give us permission to share it with the team. But other than that, we never involve third parties. We don't overshare or share at all with third parties if they don't give us their consent. We are mandated reporters, which means that if there's a child or an elder person in danger, we have to report back. Or if the survivor is trying to harm themselves or harm others, then we have to report. But other than that, whatever they tell us stays within us.
And Mary, in working in schools, if something similar like this was happening to a student or somebody and they came to you, how would that be handled?
It'd be handled really similarly. The confidentiality, all of school employees are mandated reporters as well. And as a school psychologist or a therapist, if talking to a student or a family member that might bring up something that currently has happened, that they've been victimized or even in the past, we have to hold their safety at the utmost highest regard. And so, sometimes we do have to break confidentiality. However, our approach is really to be trauma informed and to validate and to listen. And we really try to empower students and their families to actually make that call instead of us, and being there with them to do that. So if they want to reach out to Verity first before calling law enforcement, we're okay with that because we're going to follow through and make sure that happens. But giving people back that power and control when they have been victimized is how we can make sure that they feel validated and in control of some part of something that's beyond.
Is that sort of what you figured to be best practice, or is that actual policy?
So it's actually just more best practice, though the policy is that it is just mandated that you have to
Yeah.
report it. And I think that's the difference of a clinician or a school employee that does have that trauma-informed background, understands that validation and empowerment and cultural responsiveness
Totally.
is really key before taking that next step. Because then, especially as youth, when they experience victimization, the chances of them reaching out for support later on is really impacted on how that first person responds to them.
And I just want to point out real quick that we are very upfront when talking to clients that we are mandated reporters. So that's not gonna come out as a surprise or like right after they tell us, then we like, oh, mandated reporter, now we're gonna report. No, we tell them up in front, we're mandated reporters. This is what falls into it, and then we let them, decide what they want to share with us.
We do the same in schools as well, but it's really clear in every phone call and every office that you see kind of the limits of confidentiality, and it's reviewed frequently as a best practice.
And that's also the same with advocacy in the DA's office too.
Awesome. Clear expectations. What challenges do you experience in your role when working with victims? Just in general.
And related to what we were talking about, I think sometimes when we try to empower youth or families to kind of take control of that situation and there's resistance, and then eventually we do actually have to kind of go against their wishes. There are some youth that don't want things reported for various reasons. And sometimes we might have some actual empathy for why they don't want something reported, but we still have to make sure that happens to ensure their safety and the safety of others.
And do you, when taking that into account, do you look at the cultural aspects or religious aspects and things like that and why they might not, and try to maybe bring in other resources to help with that?
100%. Yeah, there are often students that feel like they don't want to tell someone, maybe because they are undocumented themselves, or that they know that the perpetrator was undocumented and they don't want to see things get worse, but they want some restoration and to be seen and validated. So all of those things are taken into consideration, and we really make sure that their concerns are heard, even if we have to do steps that maybe are against their initial wishes.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, staffing for us, staffing retention in Indian countries rougher than anywhere else, especially for our reservation because we're so remote. Finding those funds or convincing our community that, hey, we need to put some funding into this. And I'm going to be honest with you, your uncle's going to jail if we do, and that's just the reality. But we built a lot of trust in our community as a tribal government and why we were doing this, establishing the tribal court, so that there's recourse beyond tribal council. And so that's in process. But what we did do is we did hire an advocate that's our own, that understands Indian country, has been doing it for a long time, can immediately intervene. And that's just been so amazing. It's also very depressing that in the first week, our advocate had 2 engagements right out, just like that. One on our reservation and another on another reservation up in Mendocino County that was one of our tribal members. And it broke my heart because I was thinking, oh my God, been elected for this long. It took me this long to figure out this is what a path that we needed. But it's here now. It's going to stay. Our tribal membership loves it, but that's an issue. That's a challenge for us in Indian country and other tribes. And how do you do this? You know, how do we build this capacity within our tribal governments to go after our own tribal members? It's not always, but you know, frequently it is. And then deal with the fallout of that and prepare ourselves for what that fallout looks like. I still don't have training that I desperately need for my tribal council, my membership, for how do we handle the victim blaming? Because everybody goes after that individual. Oh, well, she asked for it. Well, my God, she wore short shorts. She must have been asking for it. Or, you know, she breathes. She's asking for it. It's that kind of stuff, you
Well,
know.
the irony of today being denim day, I don't know if anybody is familiar with that, but you know, she wore tight jeans, so she
That's
was
it.
asking for it.
And the flip side of that, the one that's even worse than myself being a survivor is, well, you know, he's a male. Of course he wanted it. Like, dude, I'm 9 years old. Like, let's just try to play video games, you know. But so I still don't have that kind of training. Challenges are how do we build that into our community to overcome the victim blaming without, you know, just tearing the whole community apart. It's a
I know
challenge.
you're speaking to your specific tribe in your area. Is this
All
something
of
that all over
Yeah.
is that you're working towards other tribes and other Indian country areas? Forgive me if I'm saying this incorrectly, but working on getting advocates and things like that. Is that something that's on everybody's
Yes,
radar?
it really is. And, you know, when I was walking in here, it was a conversation that I had, and that, you know, some of the tribes in Washington state know that we did mandated reporting for all of our employees. And we said, that's it. You're all going to do this. Doesn't matter if you like it or not. And they were like, well, who'd you guys use for that? Like, you know, what contractor? Well, we used the county. Like, our county is great. You know, Sonoma County loves us. They came in and did the training for us. And so, you know, so creating partnerships and encouraging other tribes to do similar stuff, you know, for when the prosecutors, again, PL 280 state, that prosecutor's not going to be tribal court. It's going to be a state, or it's going to be a county court. It's going to be a county DA that's going in.
The PL 280.
Public Law 280 is concurrent jurisdiction
Okay.
for some crimes on Indian lands. So if South Dakota is not, if a rape occurs in South Dakota, the tribe handles that, the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the tribal courts. But if the same rape occurs here in the state of California, the county DA, or if it was a state thing, they would step in and do the prosecution, and the feds wouldn't unless it hit a level of felony.
Got it. Thank you for
Yeah.
clarifying.
Well, it sounds like I need to do a training.
Yeah.
I'm doing it right now.
Well, I appreciate you for being here. Definitely learning a lot.
I just have to echo some of the things that were said about challenges working with victims. Because even though we want to, you know, there's a sense of loss of control for victims. A lot of times we kind of assume like, hey, if we do this right, they'll feel more in control. But we forget that we're, you know, often our victims are going right back into the same circumstance, or they start that victim blaming that I have collateral behaviors. If I hadn't been drunk, if I hadn't snuck out, you know, whatever, you know, all those kind of things, the self-blame, that's part of the loss of control that we leave them with. We finish, you know, doing what our investigation, we're turning it over, we're doing, you know, whatever it is, the next thing we do, at least on the law enforcement side, is we kind of have to appreciate the fact that these victims are going back into it and they're carrying those demons with them. So that's where making sure that we have advocacy in the community and within the prosecution, that we can at least support them however it plays out, however it's going to be, because just because it doesn't rise to the level of getting into the DA's office or however it's going to be, maybe the perpetrator is deceased or something and they're not going to have that closure. That having a strong appreciation for the fact that the re-victimization, whether it's from outside family or just what people do in their head, you know, following such a traumatic incident, that we have, you know, we've at least set them up in a way to be successful, that we are contacting resources within the community, statewide, whatever it is we need to do to make them, you know, can't make them whole, but we can be part of something that shapes them better for their own future as they go forward.
Absolutely. Sonoma County does have a lot of resources that I don't think everybody is always aware of. So it's good to have the advocates here to be able to pass along that information.
Yeah, although before you move on, I mean, along those lines, one of the challenges is when our prerogatives aren't aligned with what a victim would like in the case. And that can certainly be a challenge that we encounter. You know, oftentimes these crimes happen in the context of a relationship. And because of that, people tend to want, I'm generalizing, but oftentimes victims want to see pretty extreme outcomes in terms of if there does end up being a criminal case. And by extreme outcomes, I mean no consequences or the death penalty. And, you know, notwithstanding the fact that the death penalty isn't even an option for the types of crimes we're talking about, the reality is oftentimes neither one of those outcomes, neither one of the extremes is what we would objectively view as the proper outcome for the case or within the range of potentially proper outcomes. So those can be really difficult conversations to have with victims as well, especially if when they get to that point, they think they are essentially in control of what's going to be happening with the case moving forward. So those can be some hard conversations for us to have with victims. But again, another place where I think it's appropriate, necessary really for us to be really clear with them about our various roles through this process. So, when I was a younger attorney, I think I would frequently fall into a trap that a lot of attorneys do by just when you're meeting with a victim saying, what do you want to happen with this case? Well, that sends the signal to the victim that it is their decision what happens and their decision what the outcome is going to be and a guaranteed outcome at that. I think as I've matured in handling cases where I'm interacting with victims, I've approached it very differently. I talk to victims about it being strictly my responsibility to determine what an appropriate outcome is in the case, but being clear with them also in the same sentence that in making that decision, I care very much what their perspective is and what sort of impact various outcomes will have on them. So empowering them to be a part of the conversation, but also making clear that it's not their decision and also not their responsibility, because in terms of blaming themselves, victims are mindful of the fact of what the impact of the outcome of the criminal case is going to have on their family unit, their larger community, and that weighs on victims very heavily as well. So, anything we can do to take that pressure off of them, I think is a benefit to victims and kind of moving forward with what they've experienced. But that's certainly a challenge, and one area that we as attorneys handling these cases after the case has been filed have to be mindful to be careful.
Well, and that actually is basically my next question, was talking about the reality of the criminal justice system, managing expectations and outcomes for criminal cases. And Andy, you
Yeah, sorry, I kind of
just
jumped
jumped
ahead.
ahead.
Well, I'd like to
Yeah.
add, I mean, that's kind of being an advocate in the DA's office, right? These challenges and the realities of the criminal court process, like they're so layered and so complicated that we have to spend a lot of time educating. And it could be anything from, and you brought up earlier, like within a small community, people are like, well, why is this guy still walking around? Well, we have a lot of arrests made, people they get out of jail right away, they bail out. We have people who aren't arrested right away because there needs to be further investigation. So that's often a question of the survivor. So you really have to educate up front. The review process before formal charges are filed, that can take a while. So there's a lot of educating of the victim. Or in instances where charges are not able to be filed at no fault of the victim. So there's a lot of education around that. And so these are challenges in the criminal justice process. And also as an advocate in the DA's office, there's a lot of procedures and safeguards in place for the defendant. And these safeguards also can re-victimize a victim, whether they have to come to court and testify. And these are big challenges. Because it's, nobody wants to come to court regardless. But when you have to come and talk about these sensitive things, it's heartbreaking. And so you have to spend a lot of time supporting and educating around the reality of the criminal justice process.
Yeah, I think it's sometimes easy to forget that we've done this a bunch of times and we're good at this. And we forget that this is brand new to a victim who doesn't know the path, and we may walk along it with them, but we're beside them. They don't necessarily know what's ahead and how it's going to branch out, whether it's going to end in some sort of something that's satisfactory to them. And they may not even know what would make them feel better in quotes, about an outcome. So just being mindful of that, we have to, like, speak truthfully and be forthcoming about how it goes, what's going to be next. And like I said, don't promise anything. I can't speak for what an attorney is going to do or what's going to happen. Not to like throw your hands up like it's out of my court, but really just encouraging the victim in ways that can to use the Family Justice Center, to reach out to resources in the community, and just they may not be ready for it at the time, but I all the recruits at the police academy. It's just part of the mantra. If you're giving them a pamphlet with all these resources, just ask your victim to hold on to it. That maybe, not right away, but at some point, look through this. There's a lot of valuable stuff in that. You may never see that victim again, but us being really good at it, we don't want to get so practiced in it that we lose the individual, we lose the person and the heartache that they've gone through. That's what re-victimizes, feeling that they've spoken their truth and we believed it, but then it ended and it got handed to somebody else. Just, understanding that it's a terrible thing to be really, really good at, but it's also a blessing that we can actually, impart that to somebody else.
And, and I mean, big picture with the criminal justice system and expectations, just because somebody was ready to come forward and give their account of what occurred, and just because we all believe them, that doesn't mean that we can file a case and that we can move forward with the case. To be clear, we have no limits on how many cases we can file. We will file every case that we believe that we can prove. But, be careful with the language I use there. We file every case we can prove, not every case where we believe what the victim is telling us. And there's a big difference between those two things. And I know that can be a really frustrating thing for a victim who was at whatever point in their journey, they were ready to come forward and talk about what it is that happened. And it's not a reflection on whether or not what they're reporting happened or not. It's about what we can prove. But it would be irresponsible for us professionally and unfair to the victims for us to file cases that we couldn't prove. It would put all the weight of the case on their shoulders, and ultimately we wouldn't be able to obtain a verdict that would correspond with what they believe would be justice. So we have to make those evaluations at the front end. We work very closely with law enforcement to try to do everything we can to see if it would be a provable case. But the reality is many cases where people have been victimized cannot be filed. I know
That's really tough, especially, the whole reason for me getting the involvement that I did with my community as tribal leader and our staff was I wanted to catch it on the first time,
Mhm.
and we have so many that it's just a repeated, rape so many times, molested so many times. That I wanted my community to feel comfortable, go tell the chairman first time and he'll know what to do, and I feel like we've accomplished that. But, what you're talking about is on my end, it's setting expectations. Like, yeah, you're going to tell me, but hey, there's a lot to this. And then in hearing you say that, I think it's good. It's good for me to hear and, and push that into, my people, make sure they understand not every one of these cases is winnable, but you still got to report it. We still need to get it on file. We still need to show that there was an action, whether or not it was something that was prosecuted or not, but that there was this type of behavior that was occurring, and yeah, but it's heartbreaking. What you're talking about is heartbreaking, from the community leader perspective, that we just can't fix it all the time. It's just a reality. Yeah.
But in terms of what you just mentioned, and I'll just follow up on that, in terms of reporting it and making sure it's documented, what isn't a provable case today could be a provable case 6 years from now when somebody does something again. And that's not just theoretical. We file cases like that all the time.
Yeah,
It's for repeat offenders.
And I think
Or
that
new
goes
evidence
with,
comes to
you
light, yeah.
you were talking about, you were also talking about, Mary, the building the trust
Yeah.
and making sure that people feel comfortable having somewhere to go, whether it be at school or to their tribal elder or advocate or
I'm not an
police.
elder, I'm
Oh,
over
I'm
50. I
sorry.
just want to say I'm not there yet.
So sorry.
The reality of the criminal justice system, the penal code now does define 50 as elder. Not for victims. Victims, it's still much, much older, but for parole.
Andy, you're gonna get kicked out.
Thanks for that.
Okay, so how are you incorporating trauma-informed practices into when a crime is reported, whether school, law enforcement, or tribal, or even just coming to an advocate as the first step? Like, how
Well,
are
I
you-
can speak from the law enforcement side, because usually, not always, but usually that's where the first step, the first part of the path for a victim would be reporting it to law enforcement. And I can speak to the training that recruits get before they ever hit the street. The training that they get around victimology and resources and, secondary traumas, that sort of thing, as well as dealing with challenging victims, dealing with certain situations, because it's never the same. And I tell all the recruits, if you can investigate a sex crime or domestic violence, you can investigate anything. If you can get it down to talk to a person on this level, you can investigate anything. So I know it starts with the academy. I know when they get out to their specific agencies, they'll be on a field training program. Those officers are, have been trained in it and are passing on that knowledge, as well as supervisors and everything else. But we can't, not only just on the ground floor of law enforcement, we really have to look to the value of having administrators, whether it's a chief of police or a sheriff or whatever rank in the administration, that truly get this, that truly get, what these crimes can mean, not only to the person, but to a community and our community at large. And even within law enforcement, people who investigate these kinds of crimes over and over and over, it can take a toll too. So this has a huge ripple effect. But I can say from the outset, from the time they're in the police academy, all their training, whether they go on to be a detective in any of these ways, that this is it's not some old school thought process about how we're investigating this and how we're dealing with victims and families of victims. It's very much trauma informed, and it's very much about believing the victim from the outset. That's it. We've got to, don't second guess, all those kinds of things come into play, and really that it's about supporting the victim.
And would you say that has, in your experience, that's been that way for a while? Is this, because I feel like for me, this looking at things from a trauma-informed care is a relatively newer outlook on things, or maybe that's just we're using a newer word for it. But, from when you were a young, officer, was that always the outlook that you had when dealing with things?
Oh, but I can say for me personally, that's the way I approached it. That's why I became a detective in DVSA and later the sergeant there, and why I still teach it is because the times have changed around a lot of subjects, but really they're getting it. Yes, it may have a little buzzword now. That may change in the future, but what I can tell you is for the 15 years I've been teaching sex crimes investigations at the police academy here in Sonoma County, that I can tell you for sure that that's the what's been taught. That's what changes it. When we add that little kernel of knowledge to the recruits when they go out there, it makes them a better person who does better work and has more professional satisfaction and personal satisfaction in what they're doing. So I really teach to what the core of a person. Can you look at this person and imagine if that was your daughter, your son, your mom, your grandma, whoever, and just being compassionate and having empathy that way.
I'm curious if part of that training includes like the neurobiology of trauma.
Not necessarily, because, some deputies, they'll take the initial report and often they have a detective unit where they'll turn it over. So I teach kind of the whole, like, hey, if you worked at a little small agency and didn't reach out for help, you may have this from the beginning to the end. This is how we need to go. And making sure that the officers reach out to someone with more experience. Ask someone who can help you if you don't know where you are in the process. Mostly, for the most part, the agencies that have a detective unit, the first encounter that a victim would have would maybe be a patrol officer, and that can make or break a lot. And then the detective comes in, and if, depending on how that person's been handled, is how well they might receive the detective part of it. And the detectives, obviously, they have considerably more training. So I try not to, they're in the academy, they're learning everything about police work. And for the time that I get them, I give them as much as I can about, you're the first line, you're often the first person who's heard about this, and how meaningful it would be for that victim, not only at that time and this crime, and however it plays out, but for the rest of their lives. So I really put a huge, emphasis on that, because sometimes they'll just take the basics of the report and turn it over to a detective. And so in that respect, they don't, get too far into the weeds on some of it. But we have amazing people in the academy who may have had some training, in their college, expertise, they'll have something and they'll pipe in and share it with the class, and we get all sorts of good information for everybody else.
Can you speak to the neurobiology?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. And I appreciate you saying that, because in schools, what we're really trying to push for, speaking of like buzzwords, right, is actually moving beyond trauma informed and being trauma responsive or healing centered. And that's really saying that trauma informed is just having that understanding. And for me, the basics, and I think about Liz's case where she was having a hard time remembering certain details.
Yeah.
And that to me is the underpinnings of the neurobiology of trauma, like what happens to memories that are made when you're experiencing a stressful or traumatic event. And so really what does happen in the brain, right, when we experience a stressful event, is that it's our amygdala, our limbic system, which is in the center part of the brain, is really activated. And when that is activated, that's the part that actually forms our memories. And so if it's activated because we are unsafe, it's actually stopping all of that process from happening. It's going into that survival mode. And so the survival mode moves all of the blood and energy from our body into the extremities. Right. So whether that is that you're fighting, you're fleeing, you're freezing, or you're fawning, those are like the 4 general trauma responses. It actually has a really hard time then moving those memories from the limbic system through the hippocampus, which is where memories are stored. And so I think we talk a lot about that piece of trauma informed for educators, because sometimes certain things students will get activated by something, a tone of voice, the smell of cigarette smoke, if someone went and took a smoke break, right? Those things can actually put your brain back into that unsafe feeling. And now there's no learning that can happen at school, and there's no trust that can happen. And so getting to see that there are usually reasons for behind the behavior is why we're talking about it. But I see it being so important as well for law enforcement to understand that when someone has a hard time explaining something, it is actually maybe part of their traumatic experience that they had, that there's a biological factor rather than like not being cooperative or compliant in those moments. And at schools, I'm not formally an advocate, but I've had moments where we've had to bring in law enforcement. And I do feel like my role turns into an advocate to remind officers when we're working together with a student, whether it's they've been victimized or they're having thoughts of self-harm, that we have to speak a little bit differently, or that person might be having different experiences, or they're neurodivergent. So students that have different ways of thinking are also going to respond differently, and how those are perceived is really important for everyone that works in the systems to know, so that we're not re-victimizing or re-traumatizing folks.
So interesting. Thank you for that. I didn't know
Very well
any of that.
explained.
Yeah.
No, that was perfect.
Yeah, it's amazing.
So I was trying to do like my brain hand.
No.
No, I'm like, we're going down so much. Yeah, this is amazing.
And Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris and Dr. Bruce Perry are really great resources for folks to read about. And Dr. Bruce Perry's work is really leading toward healing center, and he's worked a lot with the Maori people and just how powerful indigenous practices are to the healing component, whereas so much of our Western focus are in resources that are actually not as helpful as really going back to community and connection.
That's amazing. Thank you.
I just wanted to speak on the trauma-informed practice a little bit more within the DA's office, because I think I feel like part of the reason why victim advocates were installed at a DA's office was to be trauma informed in the first part. So, there's a lot of work we do to basically help, not just educate the victim, guide them through the process, but do that in a way to support them if they have to come to court. We can do things. I worked with Andy on cases previously, we're a direct line of communication to the prosecutor to help the prosecutor understand some of the needs of the victim, some of the supports that we can use for the victim, whether that's have a comfort dog with them, have them see the courtroom in advance, other supports in the courtroom. And so I just wanted to kind of throw in some of those trauma-informed practices we use.
Thank you.
You must be trauma responsive.
Yes.
And in that, speaking of that, I was hoping that Metzley, you could touch on SARTs.
Yeah, definitely. So just to add into that, we are survivor centered, right? We meet them where they're at in their healing journey, whether that be right after the assault or many years later. When we use their words when telling their story. So if a survivor says, this is Awa, when we're telling their story, well, where was the Awa at? We use their words to help them feel more comfortable and help them feel heard and, take control, and we tend to go at their own pace. With SARTs, we are very, we have a very powerful partnership with law enforcement. So if law enforcement were to get a call for a survivor who just experienced sexual assault, it's very important to know the 5-day window. And that is because the DNA stays in the body for up to 5 days. So if law enforcement gets the call or has a victim that would like to move forward with the SART, then they'll go ahead and call Verity and request an advocate, and then we meet them at the hospital, or that's our first connection. Now, if a survivor were to call our hotline at Verity, we would explain to them exactly how the process of a SART is, really inform them of just how the whole thing's gonna hold and where they're gonna go. Basically, we run through a scenario of what's gonna happen. We really empower the client to choose whatever they feel best. We give them their options, such as if they want to go ahead and move forward with anonymous SARTs or, full on. And so then we call law enforcement. We help them set up that SART with law enforcement. So it goes vice versa. So that's where the powerful partnership comes in. We think it's very important to always let them know their options. And we also explain as far as why we may need certain information for law enforcement to approve the SART. It could be very specific questions, and that's just for law enforcement to approve the SART. But we explain to the survivors ahead of time, we believe you. This is not because that's in doubt, but they need those specific information, the address of where the assault happened, to see what jurisdiction is going to handle it, what type of assault happened. And then law enforcement is in charge of, connecting the saners to do the SART and coordinate all of how the survivor's going to get to the hospital to get the SART. Again, if the survivor does not feel comfortable with law enforcement transporting them or anything like that, then we come in and try to work how does the survivor feel most comfortable with. I don't know if you have any other questions.
No, that's awesome. And just wanted to say, you said that before that the survivor will never have to pay for a SART. Is that correct?
Correct. Yes, law enforcement pays for the SART, and it gets a little tricky because the survivors have to get medically clear before going to the SART, and that's the tricky part, that if they were to get any other services or any medication in the ER, that's where they will get billed. But everything that gets in the SART, all the exams, anything like that, it's totally free to the survivor.
And also one other thing, you had mentioned that they can get a start even if they choose not to file right then.
Correct.
They don't want to necessarily file a police report right then. They are still able to get that and have up to a year.
Yes. So if they choose to go the anonymous route, we coordinate with law enforcement. So they never have to speak to law enforcement. We coordinate with law enforcement and then we get them to the hospital. And yes, they have up to a year to see if they want to go ahead and put their name into that kit or not. So they won't have that law enforcement interview or anything. This is a great option for those who want to save the DNA and then, see if they want to later on prosecute, work with law enforcement. But yeah, we always give them those two options.
And in the police academy, I bring a victim kit, SART kit, and I bring a suspect SART kit and open it and explain the forms to the officers. Now, again, these are going to be probably just patrol officers and wouldn't necessarily be authorizing it, but it's also because, they may be going to collect the kit and bring it down to wherever their headquarters is to book it into evidence. But I show them, out of a reason, one of the reasons is so they have some expectation about what their victim's about to go through. And to, just let them know that this is really intrusive and there's a lot of trust that has to go on. And if they're going to do an anonymous report, I go over that as well. So that they have an appreciation for the fact that you're asking somebody who's just been through something really horrible, maybe very recently, maybe, within the 5-day window or so, that still that in and of itself is, what's going to be their mindset when they're, feet in the stirrups and flat on your back in an exam room. That's a lot to take in. So really personalizing that. So they get that, even though often these officers aren't going to actually get that far into the investigation, but this is what they're, they have an understanding what the reporting party is going to have to go through.
And awareness of the process, I think, as we're seeing here, is half the battle, knowing what's happening. Going back to Liz's story that we had talked about, can you tell us a little bit about how you feel that outcomes could have been different with different support, and also including in that if there were any better cultural sensitivity practices within our roles that could assist with that, depending on changing some of the facts of the story, maybe if there was an undocumented worker or a tribal member, and how those things might have changed the outcomes to Liz's story.
One thing that was important to Liz was that she felt like she was being blamed through some of the officers' questioning. And I can absolutely understand why she had that perspective from the questions that were being asked. However, those might have been really important questions during the investigation and questions that we needed from an investigative standpoint an answer to. So with those two ideas in mind, I mean, that whole issue could have been addressed by the officer explaining to Liz, I'm going to ask you a ton of questions because we need to know everything. And our goal is to never have to ask you these questions again. We want to do the most complete and thorough question answer investigation that we can at this point. Some of these questions might feel like I'm challenging you. I'm not. I'm just trying to get at your perspective, what happened, why things happened the way they did. Nothing, and just express story. There is nothing here that's meant to suggest that you did anything wrong, could have or should have done anything different. But these are questions that naturally come up in these types of investigations, and said nobody has to ask you this later or be wondering about this later, or you don't get surprised by this question for the first time on a witness stand potentially someday. So just by the investigator acknowledging that there were going to be some questions that would be perceived certain ways by the person that they were interviewing, that could have been addressed up front. And I think Liz the person who's being interviewed could be less taken aback by the questions, wouldn't have any reason to feel defensive when asked the questions, wouldn't have to feel like they have to give a defensive answer that shows they didn't do something wrong, and they can just be open, honest, and give the best account that they can from their perspective. So that was one thing that I saw could have been a big change.
Yeah, I'd love to hear that, because that is exactly what I tell the recruits in the academy, is explain the why. Like, it's not just that I want to get up in your business. I need to know this because, they would be surprised on the stand if someone said, why did it take so long to report? You know, there's a way to ask it in a way, but even if you had to ask it really bluntly, you know, just kind of get out there in the forefront and say, this is, I'm gonna have to ask you certain things and, you know, and this is why. And it's not to blame you, that kind of thing.
And there's no wrong
Yeah.
answers. There's nothing
Yeah.
that indicates that you did something wrong.
Right,
Right.
exactly,
But we need to know all of the circumstances and how you perceived everything.
right.
I feel like because I watch Law and Order SVU, I'm an expert in all of it.
Can you get DNA that fast? too?
Yeah.
I didn't really hear it.
Hearing a little sound every
Yeah.
couple minutes, although it's not playing now for those that are listening. No, you know, it kind of, if this was an Indian person having that conversation, you know, again, you're setting expectations, you're being open and honest on the front end. I guess for me, just, I look at that, and if it was my tribal member, I'm thinking, when would I want that level of scrutiny and that level of conversation to happen? And who do I want present to listen to that? You know, and for me, you know, I listened to some of those conversations happen because I was requested to be there, and understand culturally, you know, we use that word culture. It has a different meaning for me than it does everybody else in the room. And that, you know, it's Kashaya refers to the agreements we have in the before world, and how we live those out here in this world. And there's some really serious consequences to not following that. My tribal members know that, they feel that. And, you know, and at some point, you know, I feel like I'm translating when I'm not. And so, you know, I've been in a conversation like that and seen one of my tribal members looking at me to validate that it's okay to say. And yeah, you know, I couldn't imagine what that person would have gone through if I wasn't there, or if that cultural authority wasn't there in the room. And it's not every Indian, but it's that Indian. And to me, that's a really high level of importance to make sure that, you know, continuity of cultural care and perspective is brought into those conversations the way that we have them. So I was looking at this lady, the things that she went through, and kind of like thinking, how could things be different for if it was one of my tribal members? How would I want that? You know, a lot of it would be, I just would want my tribal member, or if it was any tribal chair I know that is worth their weight, would want to make sure that somebody was in there that was culturally competent in that room. You know, when if it's our children, in this case, this lady's not, you know, not a child. If it's one of our children, you know, having the opportunity to go into the Family Resource Center and place medicine in places that are there for the protection of the children there is something that our tribe was afforded to do. And I can't be in that room in that situation, but that medicine is, and that's cultural competency. That medicine's there to protect that child and their parent, no matter what, you know, doorway in, doorway out. So it's just some of those little cultural competency things that I would want to see and pray that would be in place. Sometimes they can be, you know, sometimes in those rooms where you all are conducting your work, it's not, it can't be done. But I guess I just would hope that somewhere along the line that you know, traditional aspect would be brought into play.
Having somebody that understands
Some-
that side of it.
Like somebody or something.
Yeah.
Like, right, like I'm not in that room with the child or the family resource centers over there. That's not going to be me that's in there, but that medicine's in. So I have that level of comfort knowing that no matter what, that person is protected in the way that they're supposed to be, in alignment with my cultural values and traditions. Something to be said for that,
Yeah.
especially for a chairman that's nosy and, you know, opinionated.
I like that. Does anybody else have?
Well, I just wanted to add, when we listen to the survivor story, like there's two different things going on there that are really concerning to me. One of the things, well, so we have the issue of the assaults, right? And then we also have the issue, the stalking issue. And so we have, from an advocacy perspective, we don't have the advocate in the story providing her support and resources for the emotional trauma of the assaults, as well as resource support for protection. And so I think that's something differently, if I was involved in the story, that would be happening to the survivor.
Definitely. And just to add to that, from our end, during the law enforcement interview, we would definitely intervene. That's something that we do is we read body language as well. So even if our survivor is not vocal as to like, I need a break or this is too much, like we can sense, we can see their body language. And that's where we would, ask for a break or, check in with law enforcement. And the way that we would intervene is we would take law enforcement out and ask, where are you coming from? Like, let me understand why you're asking this question or certain type of question, just to see if maybe we can remind them to be more trauma informed or see if they need help kind of like rewording that. I don't want to get too much into that because I know that's, but we would definitely check in, and then we would go ahead and check in with the survivor and see where they're at. Is this too much for you? Like, do you want a break? Do you want to just, let's finish this interview? What, like, talk to me, like, we're here for you. A lot of times survivors are intimidated by law enforcement, right? And they're like, being interviewed. So they're not gonna be vocal to say like, this is too much for me. And that's where we come in. And that's where like we want those survivors to be safe with us and be that confident in telling us like, or just like saying, oh, like, I can't, and then that's where we will speak up. Statistics shows that victims feel more comfortable with someone, not law enforcement, in the room while they're having an interview as well. And so, and I feel like at this point, having that partnership with all of our MDT members or in all of our partners, it speaks a lot. And I definitely think it would change Liz's story if they had that collaboration, they had that partnership as well.
Can I just add on to that too? Because you said something that reminded me of it. I have a hard time convincing my tribal members that, if they're in the industry of sex trafficking, that they're victims and that they can be raped if they're, a part of that industry. I don't know how else to say that. And it's a challenge. It's a challenge. You kind of just skirted a little bit towards that just now and then moved away from it appropriately. But yeah, that's not this lady's case, obviously, but it's over and over. And the sex trafficking thing in Indian country is very real. And in every case that I've seen, that's just me. Every case that I've seen in my community, it's a family member that started it and initiated it and got them into it. And there's, and you can't, it's impenetrable for me. I'm a 100% loss on that. I've never convinced any of them to come forward, never convinced any of them that this is what was happening. I've always been asked to keep it like, hey, just keep this between us, but I want you to know in case I come up missing. And I'm like, that's not the threshold for this. The threshold is, hey man, they're convincing you to do this. Let me step in and help.
That's heartbreaking.
Welcome to Indian country.
Jeez.
Has being a mandated reporter made it easier, kind of taking some of the pressure off of?
It's a double-edged sword. It has quite a bit, especially because, but then the flip side of it is they know, like, if we tell them that those guys are probably going to say something.
Yeah. But at least they hopefully don't blame you for telling at that point.
No, if it rises to the level it needs because they want action or they're scared, but again, it's tough.
Yeah. So you think it's had a bit of a chilling effect?
Yeah, and they'll leave details out so that individuals, even if I have to report, well, what am I reporting on? That this individual said that she was being sex trafficked, but won't tell me anything else about it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I just wanted to kind of open it up to all of you, if there was anything that you wanted to speak on in your roles or what we've already talked about, just kind of open it up if there was anything that you wanted to say or how you work together. Like you mentioned, this is a collaborative effort, and I think this has really highlighted how much each little piece affects the other pieces. So if there was anything anybody wanted to say.
Yeah, keep Indian country at this table.
I'd love it.
You need us, we need you. The missing and murdered Indigenous women and men, is real.
Yeah.
You know, my son's uncle is somehow beat himself to death with a baseball bat and threw himself into a river. And that's the kind of stuff, you know, that happens over and over and over in Indian country and it's never solved. You know, the rapes, the just horrible things. You know, we buried a tribal member's ceremonial regalia the other day in accordance with our rules for burial, cultural law for burial, because he's been missing for 45 years. And at some point we have to still do that. Can't go on in perpetuity. And, you know, and the rapes of our women and young kids, I just love the work that y'all do. Because, you know, it's advocacy, it's every side of the pendulum for how we protect our tribal membership is inside of this room. So keep Indian country at the table. If it's not me, let it be somebody else, but make sure it's somebody that actually knows. Leadership position, not somebody that just says that, oh, I work with them, but has never gotten that 5 o'clock in the morning call from their tribal member who just got raped, you know? And so, yeah, I thank you for doing this. I really appreciate it.
We really appreciate you being here and bringing all of your knowledge. Thank you. Okay, well, as you've all heard, there is a lot of work to be done in the ways that we support victims of crime. We challenge each of you not to leave today letting this be a conversation that you had, but rather asking yourself and acting upon what steps can you take to help facilitate change in the work that we do. Is your organization victim-centered and trauma-informed? Are there gaps in the services that you provide, and how can you help fill those? At this time, we'd like to thank our panelists for being here today and taking the time to have this dialogue. Thank you so much. And if you'd like to continue to commemorate National Crime Victim Rights Week, please come to a resource fair that we are holding on Saturday, April 27th from 11 to 4 p.m. at Old Courthouse Square in downtown Santa Rosa. We'll have musical performances, kids activities, face paint. I'm doing it, so it won't be great, but it'll be there. Little taco truck and many other local service providers. So thank you so much. Thank you everyone that has joined in on this webinar. This was recorded, so I'll make it available
Can I just add
somehow. Yeah.
something real quick? For those survivors out there, I just wanna remind you that we see you, we believe you, and we're here for you. And don't feel alone. We're here for you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Miss. Thank you, everyone.